"That machine hasn't laid a decent bead in 4 years. You're welcome to give it a go, sir, but we can't promise you much." That's what the young technician said to a 76-year-old man standing at the edge of the registration table with a leather rod roll tucked under one arm and grease worked permanently into the lines of his knuckles. The old man didn't argue. He didn't explain himself. He looked at the Welder, a Lincoln Idealarc from the early 80s, its casing cracked along one corner, its ground clamp held together with electrical tape, and he said, "It'll do." His name was Wendell Cormier, and if you'd passed him on Weiss Road in Dartmouth on any given Tuesday morning, you would have seen an old man with a slight list to his right side, a courtesy of a compressed disc in his lumbar that had been his companion since 1994, and a canvas jacket with the sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the October chill. You would not have guessed, from the outside, that the hands inside those rolled sleeves had spent 33 years keeping the warships of the Royal Canadian Navy in fighting condition. You would not have known that those hands had once re-welded the fractured keel plate of a frigate in Bahrain in 40-degree heat with a portable generator and 2 rods of his own manufacture. You would not have known, and Wendell Cormier would never have told you, because that wasn't the kind of man he was. If you believe that skill speaks louder than any certificate on a wall, type craftsman in the comments and stay for this story. Wendell had retired from the Royal Canadian Navy in 2008 after 33 years as a hull technician and structural welder, rising to the rank of Chief Petty Officer First Class. He had served aboard 6 ships: HMCS Halifax, HMCS Fredericton, HMCS Charlottetown, and 3 others whose deployments he was still technically not meant to discuss in full. And in those 33 years he had welded, repaired, patched, reinforced, and rebuilt more steel than most certified structural engineers would ever touch in their careers. He had worked in sea states that made the deck pitch 30 degrees. He had worked in temperatures that froze the moisture out of electrode coatings. He had worked in confined spaces so tight that he had to exhale fully just to fit his shoulders inside, and he had made welds in those spaces that passed inspection every single time. He lived in a narrow 2-story house on Windmill Road in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, the same house he and his wife Marguerite had bought in 1986, when she was pregnant with their son Paul and the market was reasonable and the view of the harbour was worth the commute. Marguerite had passed in the spring of 2021, a stroke, swift and without warning, the kind that gives no time for preparation and no room for last words. She had been in the kitchen. Wendell had been in the garage. He had come inside to ask her something about supper and found her on the floor, and the world since then had been a quieter place than he had ever expected the world to be. The garage was where he spent most of his time now. It was not a garage in the ordinary sense. There was a Miller Syncrowave TIG unit against the back wall that he had saved for over 2 years. There was a steel worktop he had fabricated himself from 3/16 plate, perfectly level, checked with a precision level he had borrowed from the base 20 years ago, and never returned. There were rod ovens, 2 of them, one for low hydrogen electrodes, one for stainless, and racks of consumables organized by diameter and classification the way another man might organize a library. On a peg by the door hung the leather electrode roll. Marguerite had made it for him in 1991 from a piece of leather she bought at a shop in Halifax, hand-stitched with a curved needle, with 20 individual pockets sized for different rod diameters. The leather had darkened over 30 years of handling. The stitching had been repaired twice, both times by Wendell himself using the same curved needle she had left in the kit. He brought it everywhere. The competition was called the Nova Scotia Skilled Trades Invitational, held every October at the Dartmouth Trades and Technology Centre on Weiss Road. It was not a national event. The Canadian Welding Bureau did not sanction it. It was a regional competition, 20 to 30 competitors from across the province, and sometimes a few from New Brunswick, testing plate welding, pipe welding, and structural fit-up at a format that closely mirrored the practical examination for Red Seal certification. The entry fee was $50. The prizes were modest: gift cards, plaques, 1 year of free membership at the Trade Centre, and a bursary donated by a local fabrication shop for competitors under 25. But the people who competed took it seriously. There were journeyman boilermakers from the Irving shipyards. There were pipe fitters from the construction trades. There were young apprentices who had grown up watching welding tutorials online. and borrowed their employer's equipment to compete. And there was Lucas Thorne, 27 years old, 3 consecutive wins at this competition, a Red Seal welder who worked for a structural firm in Dartmouth, and who arrived that morning with a hard-sided equipment case containing his personal Miller Multimatic, his own welding helmet with a true color lens, his own gloves, his own fume extractor, and a binder of personal welding procedure specifications that he had spent 2 years developing and refining. Lucas Thorne was good. There was no question about that. He was fast, consistent, and technically capable in a way that only genuine practitioners can be. He also had the particular bearing of a young man who had never been seriously challenged at something he considered his own territory. Wendell Cormier registered at the front desk at 7:30, 15 minutes before the first stage was scheduled to begin. The desk was staffed by 2 people, an older woman named Diana Ouellette, who ran the Trade Centre's continuing education program, and a younger man named Jamie Prescott, who coordinated competition logistics. Diane looked up when Wendell approached. "Are you here for the invitational?" she asked, with the careful politeness of someone not entirely sure of the answer. Wendell set his registration form on the counter, signed up for the plate and pipe divisions. Diane looked at the form. Her expression did not change, but Jamie glanced up from his laptop and back down again in the way that young men do when they are being diplomatic about something. "Mr. Cormier," Diane said, "you haven't listed any equipment. Are you bringing your own unit?" "No." Wendell folded the form neatly and slid it back toward her. "Was hoping you'd have a loaner." Diane and Jamie exchanged a look. Jamie stood up. "We have a couple," he said carefully. "They're older machines. They're what we use for orientation workshops, not really suited for competition." "I'll manage," Wendell said. Jamie went into the equipment storage room and returned 2 minutes later with the Lincoln Idolark. A stick welder, the kind of machine that had been workmanlike once, in the way that everything workmanlike eventually becomes tired. The casing had a crack along the lower right corner. The ground clamp was held together with black electrical tape. The lead itself was stiff with age, the insulation checking near the connector. The electrode holder had been dropped more than once, its jaws slightly misaligned. Jamie set it on the counter with the expression of a man presenting something he is embarrassed by. "This is the best of the loaners," he said. "The output's inconsistent above 130 amps. The ground's intermittent. We think it's the clamp." He paused, searching for a diplomatic word. "The control range isn't what it used to be." "That machine hasn't laid a decent bead in 4 years, Diane added quietly. "You're welcome to give it a go, sir, but we can't promise you much." Wendell picked up the electrode holder. He didn't plug anything in. He turned the holder over in his hands, pressed the jaws together 3 times, listened to the spring tension, and set it back down. "Got a bench I can use before the first stage?" he asked. "And I'll need about 35 minutes. They put him at a workbench at the back of the welding bays, away from the main floor where the other entrants were setting up. Wendell laid the machine on its side, opened his jacket and began. He started with the ground clamp. The electrical tape came off to reveal a corroded connection at the copper lug. Not failed, but resistive, the kind of resistance that bleeds heat into the cable instead of into the arc. He cleaned the lug faces with a wire brush from his jacket pocket, refastened the connection, and wrapped it properly with fresh self-amalgamating tape from his kit. 40 seconds. Then the lead itself. The checking near the connector was cosmetic. The conductor underneath was intact, but the stiff outer jacket was restricting the cable's natural drape, which would have added mechanical tension to the connection during movement. He warmed the jacket with his hands, working it back and forth until it softened, and zip-tied the connector to a short section of hose clamp to relieve the stress at the joint. The electrode holder was a more patient job. The jaw misalignment was causing uneven grip on the rod, which meant inconsistent electrical contact, which meant arc instability at the moment of strike. He disassembled the holder on the bench, it was 4 parts, and bent the jaw arm back to correct angle against the edge of the workbench using a flat-faced hammer from his roll. He checked the spring tension, replaced one of the contact faces with a spare from his kit, and reassembled it. He tested the jaw action against his thumb. Even pressure, consistent close. Better. Then he turned to the machine itself. He did not open the casing. He was not permitted to under competition rules, and he had read the competition rules before registering. What he did was adjust the machine's polarity jumper to DCE, direct current electrode positive, from the default of DCEN that someone had apparently left it on, which would have made the arc run cooler and more erratic than necessary. He set the amperage to 110 and held the lead near his ear while he briefly energized the machine, listening to the hum. The transformer was tired but not damaged. The arc would be inconsistent above 125 amps, as Jamie had said, but at 105 to 115 it should be workable. Wendell had once welded a hull breach on HMCS Fredericton with a machine in worse condition than this, in a forward void space with 4 inches of standing water on the deck plates while the ship was underway in the Gulf of Oman. He had a sense of what a machine could give him if he asked it correctly. He sorted his rods last. The center's loaner electrodes were E61T and 1/8 inch, stored in an open bin that had not seen a rod oven in some time. He could tell by the feel. Moisture changes the coating surface tension, makes it slightly tacky under pressure, and he could tell by the weight, the way a hydrated electrode sits differently in the hand than a properly conditioned one. He spread 20 rods across the bench and began sorting by touch, selecting the 12 driest of the lot, the ones with the most intact coating at the stub end, and placed them in the leather roll his wife had made, each in its own pocket. Then he assembled the welder, reconnected everything, and sat back. The entire process had taken 32 minutes. He picked up the machine and walked back to the competition floor. The first stage of the invitational was a flat position butt weld on 3/8 inch mild steel plate, judged on root penetration, bead consistency, and the absence of porosity and undercut. It was the foundational test, designed to confirm that every competitor could perform the basic joint correctly under observation. Most of the bet competitors treated it as a warm-up. Lucas Thorne ran his first pass in under 5 minutes, flat and clean, his arc barely whispering in the bay. The bead was consistent, the crown height controlled the tie-ins textbook. He capped it in a second pass, ground the surface lightly and submitted the plate to the judge with the confidence of a man who had done this many times. The judge, a senior instructor from the Nova Scotia Community College Trades Program named Robert Feeney, inspected it and wrote down a number. Wendell was in the third group. He sat on a stool near his station and watched the first 2 groups work, observing not the welders but the light on the plates. The way the arc reflected off the steel told him things about the ambient temperature in the bay, the moisture in the air, the way the steel was conducting heat away from the weld pool. Small things. The kind of things you learn after the first 10,000 hours and continue learning for the next 40,000. When his group was called, he walked to the station, positioned the plate in the fixture, and ran a quick ground bead to check the arc quality before the clock started. The arc struck rough, a characteristic of moisture in the coating, and then settled into a rhythm he knew how to read. He adjusted his angle 2 degrees, slowed his travel speed by roughly 10% to accommodate the inconsistent penetration profile of the old machine, and began. He welded slowly, slower than almost anyone else in the room. There is a thing that happens in welding when a person has done it long enough to stop thinking about the process and starts, instead, to listen to it. The arc makes a sound, a crackling, spitting sound that changes with penetration, with travel speed, with the distance between the electrode tip and the base metal. Most welders learn to read the sound consciously. The best welders stop reading it consciously and start feeling it, the way a musician stops counting beats and starts hearing music. Wendell Cormier had stopped counting beats in 1988. He ran his root pass, chipped and brushed without hurrying, ran his fill pass, ran his cap, and submitted the plate. Robert Feeney picked it up. He turned it over. He ran his thumbnail along the weld surface, an old judge's habit, checking the profile by tactile sense before the visual assessment. Then he looked at the root, at the tie-ins, at the cap. He wrote down a number. The posted scores showed Wendell 2 points behind Lucas Thorne. Second place overall, with a borrowed 1980s stick welder and rods that had spent the better part of a year sitting in a damp storage bin. The apprentice from the adjacent station, a 22-year-old from Truro named Kyle Fenwick, looked at the board, then at the ancient Lincoln machine on Wendell's station, then at the board again. "Is that the loaner?" he asked his partner. His partner looked. "Has to be." Kyle said nothing else. But he watched Wendell walk back to his stool with the particular stillness of a man who had nowhere to be and no reason to rush, and something in the watching was careful now, in a way it had not been before. The lunch break was 40 minutes. The trade centre provided coffee and sandwiches in the break room off the main corridor. Most competitors clustered in groups, the Irving Yard guys together, the young apprentices together, Lucas Thorne in a corner with the man who had coached him through his Red Seal, reviewing plates and talking in low, technical tones. Wendell took his coffee and a plastic-wrapped sandwich and found a spot at the end of a table near the window that looked out onto the Dartmouth waterfront. He could see the harbour from there. He could see the superstructure of a container ship working its way past the Narrows, and beyond it the grey suggestion of the open Atlantic. He had spent most of his adult life looking at that water. He had left it and come back to it more times than he could count, and every time he returned it looked the same, cold and patient and utterly indifferent to anything he had done or failed to do. He found that comforting now in a way he hadn't when he was younger. Marguerite used to say he was half fish. She said it because he would come home from 6 months at sea, and within a week he'd be itchy to go back. And she said it without resentment, which was one of the many things he had loved about her. She had understood him in the way that certain people understand certain other people, not by explanation, but by long attention, the kind that has no agenda. He missed her in the particular way that grief settles after a few years, not as a wound but as an absence in the room, a shape where something should be. He looked at his hands around the coffee cup. The right hand had a scar across the first 2 knuckles from a spatter burn in 2002. The left thumb had been broken in 1997 and healed slightly crooked. Both had the darkened pores of a man who had been too familiar with metal and heat for too long to get entirely clean. He thought, not for the first time, that the only real record of his 33 years was in his hands and in the steel of ships that were still sailing with welds he had made 20 years ago. That was enough. The pipe stage was the second and harder of the 3. A 4-inch Schedule 40 carbon steel pipe, 6G position. The pipe tilted at 45 degrees in a fixed fixture, requiring the welder to work through every position without rotating the workpiece. Root, hot pass, fill, cap, full penetration. This was the stage that sorted the journeyman from the tradespeople who had put in the real hours. Lucas Thorne posted his result first, and it was excellent. His arc consistency through the overhead and vertical portions of the joint was controlled, and even his cap profile clean. He had done this hundreds of times on structural work, and it showed. Wendell spent 2 minutes examining the fixture before he started. He checked the pipe-to-pipe gap with his bare fingers, feeling for consistency around the circumference. He adjusted the ground clamp position, moving it 6 inches closer to the joint to reduce the length of the current path and stabilize the arc at lower amperage. He had learned this adjustment on a destroyer in the North Atlantic in 1993 from a petty officer named Duchesne, who was the finest 6G welder Wendell had ever personally watched work, and who had died of a heart attack in Shearwater in 2011. He ran the route with a whipping motion, a technique older than most of the competition equipment in the room, a technique from the stick welding era before wire feed became standard, a technique that required a degree of hand control that very few people still practiced. The route came in full and consistent. He chipped, brushed, and ran the hot pass at 110 amps, reading the machine's rhythm at every position change, compensating in real time for the arc inconsistencies the old transformer still threw at him. 45 minutes after the stage began, Robert Feeney measured and assessed the finished weld. Wendell's pipe score came in above Lucas Thorne's. The murmur that started at the scoreboard moved through the competition floor like current through a cable, not dramatic, not loud. Just a shift in the air, the kind that happens when 50 people simultaneously realize they are seeing something that does not fit their expectations. The old man beat Thorne on pipe with the loner. Lucas Thorne heard the murmur. He did not react visibly, but his coach leaned toward him and said something quiet, and Lucas spent the next 10 minutes at his station rechecking his samples, with the air of a man who has encountered a problem he cannot immediately categorize. He was good enough to know that what he had just seen was not luck, but he was 27 years old, and 27 years old has a particular difficulty accepting that excellence can arrive from a source it did not anticipate. At 1:15, Lucas Thorne stepped outside the trade centre and made a phone call. The man he called was his sponsor, the owner of the structural firm where he worked, a man named Gary Vale, who sat on the trade centre's advisory board and who had a particular interest in seeing the invitational run fairly, which was how he would describe his concern when he called Diane Ouellet at 1:22. Gary Vale raised the concern that the elderly competitor using the loaner equipment had likely modified the machine in a manner that fell outside competition regulations. The rules were clear. Loaner equipment was to be used as provided. Any modification constituted an unfair advantage. Diane Ouellet, who was a fair-minded woman and knew the regulations as well as Gary Vale did, said she would look into it. She hung up and walked to the back of the welding bay, where Jamie Prescott was reviewing the afternoon's logistics. "We need to check the loaner machine," she said. "There's been a concern raised." They walked together to Wendell's station. Wendell was sitting on his stool, reading the grain of his weld samples under a pen light with the patience of a man who has no concern about what an inspection will find. "Mr. Cormier," Diane said, "we've had a question raised about whether you've modified the loaner equipment beyond what the rules allow." Wendell set down the pen light. "I re-terminated the ground clamp connection, correct the polarity setting on the machine's jumper, and reconditioned the electrode holder jaws. No internal casing work, no new parts except a contact face on the holder, which I paid for myself." He reached into his jacket pocket and set a small paper receipt on the station. "That's from the supply room, $2.30. Diane looked at the receipt. Jamie crouched next to the machine. "I can show you everything I did," Wendell said. "Takes about 4 minutes to explain." It took 6 because Jamie asked questions. At the end of it, Jamie stood up and looked at Diane. "None of this is prohibited," he said. Section 6, Paragraph 2. Equipment maintenance and electrical connection corrections are explicitly permitted. "This is," he paused looking at the ground clamp. "This is honestly better than how we should have had it to begin with." Diane thanked Wendell and walked back toward the registration desk to make a phone call she was not looking forward to. Wendell went back to his pen light. The final stage was an overhead structural weld, a T-joint in overhead position on one 2-inch plate, the kind of weld that tests patience more than almost any other because gravity works against you. In every pass, the pool wants to fall, and the only thing that keeps it honest is the welder's ability to read and adjust faster than the metal moves. The afternoon light had dropped. The October cold was working its way through the trade centre's roll-up doors. Most of the competitors had been on their feet for 6 hours, and it showed in their posture. Wendell had not changed posture once. He positioned himself under the fixture with the care of a man who has worked overhead more times than the building he was standing in was old. He checked his body angle, weight on the right foot, left shoulder, rotating into the weld position, head tilted back at an angle that would keep his eyes in line with the electrode travel without putting his neck into a position it couldn't sustain for the duration of the joint. He struck the arc. The machine threw its characteristic roughness for the first second and then settled, and Wendell's hand compensated before the roughness had fully resolved, because he had been reading that machine all day and he knew exactly what it would do and when it would do it. He maintained a tighter arc than he normally would, closer electrode to work distance, compensating for the machine's lower effective output, and he ran each pass more slowly than standard procedure to let the pool establish itself against gravity. His left arm held steady in a way that takes years to build. Not muscular steadiness exactly. Muscle strength fades quickly in overhead work, but structural, the kind that comes from knowing precisely how to load a joint so the skeleton, not the muscle, bears the weight. He ran 4 passes in 22 minutes. When the plate came down from the fixture and Robert Feeney assessed it under the overhead fluorescent, the silence that followed lasted about 3 seconds, which is a long time when 15 people are standing around a judge waiting for a number. Feeney said quietly, "That's the cleanest overhead I've seen in this competition in 4 years. The composite scores were calculated. Wendell Cormier had won the Nova Scotia Skilled Trades Invitational by a margin of 11 points over Lucas Thorne. The numbers were simple. The math was not complicated. What was complicated was the feeling in the room, a recalibration, the kind that happens when the people who have spent years trusting a particular framework for understanding excellence realize all at once that the framework was incomplete. Lucas Thorne requested a formal review. He stood at the registration desk and said carefully and without raised voice that he felt the equipment discrepancy between his personal unit and the loaner, even accounting for Mr. Cormier's adjustments, could not credibly account for the performance differential, and that a formal inspection and scoring review was warranted. Diane Ouellet agreed to convene a review panel. The panel consisted of herself, Robert Feeney, and a journeyman boilermaker from the Irving shipyards named Don Arsenault, who had served on the Invitational's judging panel for 9 years. They reviewed the welds and the machine for 45 minutes. Don Arsenault, who had 30 years in industrial welding and knew what he was looking at, handled the pipe sample for a long time before he set it down. This route is full penetration, full fusion, no lack of sidewall tie-in, no porosity, he said. From an E6013 rod, on a 40-year-old Lincoln, he looked at the machine. Whoever ran this machine knows this machine better than the people who built it. Lucas did not respond to this. He stood slightly apart from the table with his arms crossed. Not in defiance exactly, but with the posture of a young man who is processing something he had not expected to process. It was Don Arsenault who walked over to Wendell's station, where Wendell was cleaning and re-rolling his rods into the leather pouch. "Navy?" Don said. Wendell looked up. 33 years, hull tech. "Which ships?" Wendell told him. Don was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled out his phone and stepped away. He was gone for 8 minutes. When he returned, he said to Diane, "You might want to hold the formal ruling. I've made a call." At 3:45, a dark blue Crown Victoria with a naval base parking pass in the window pulled into the Trade Centre's lot. 2 people got out. The first was a young warrant officer in uniform who stood near the vehicle and said nothing. The second was a man in his late 60s, civilian clothes, silver hair cut short in the way that doesn't leave when the uniform does, a bearing that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with 30 years of telling large groups of people exactly what was expected of them. His name was Commodore Alan Bryce, Royal Canadian Navy, retired. He had commanded Maritime Forces Atlantic from 2004 to 2008, and before that had spent 12 years in ship support and maintenance coordination, which meant he had worked alongside every hull technician and structural welder in the Atlantic Fleet for the better part of a decade. He had driven from CFB Halifax because a phone call from Don Arsenault had reached a friend at the Naval Association who had heard the name Wendell Cormier and known immediately what it meant. He walked into the Trade Centre, looked around the welding bays, and found Wendell at the far station. Wendell saw him coming. He stood, carefully, because standing from a stool on a bad back is a production, and straightened in a way that had nothing to do with formal protocol and everything to do with recognition. The way you straighten for someone who was part of something important and still is. "Commodore Bryce," Wendell said. "Chief Petty Officer Cormier." Bryce shook his hand. The handshake lasted longer than handshakes usually do. "I heard you've been making machines do things they have no business doing." "Just asking them correctly, sir." Bryce turned and addressed the room, not loudly, but in the particular register of a man who does not need volume to be heard. "This man," he said, "is Chief Petty Officer First Class Wendell Cormier, Royal Canadian Navy, retired. He served 33 years as a hull technician and structural welder. He was the senior hull tech at Maritime Fleet Maintenance Facility Cape Scott during the Halifax-class refit program, where his team completed 47 structural repairs assessed as exceeding the original build standard." He paused. "In 1999, during HMCS Charlottetown's deployment to the Adriatic, Chief Petty Officer Cormier repaired a stress fracture in the ship's keel structure while the vessel was underway in Sea State 4. The repair held for 7 years. The procedure he developed for that repair was subsequently incorporated into the RCN's Hull Maintenance Technical Manual as a standard operating procedure for comparable fractures on Halifax-class hulls." He looked around the room. "What you saw today is not a trick. It is not an anomaly. It is what 33 years of service, discipline, and dedication to craft produces in a person. And that is not something you can calibrate out of a machine or buy at a trade show." The room was quiet. Lucas Thorne stood near the scoring table. His coach had a hand on his shoulder. The expression on Lucas's face was not anger, and it was not embarrassment exactly. It was something more uncomfortable than either, the look of a young man who has genuinely understood something for the first time and cannot unmake the understanding. Gary Vale, who had arrived shortly before Bryce, said nothing at all. Don Arsenault, standing by the door, nodded once, the way a man nods when something confirms what he already suspected. It was Lucas Thorne who approached Wendell first. He walked over to the station without his coach, which took something, and extended his hand. "That overhead," he said. "I've never seen that arc control in that position, especially not with stick at that amperage." "Travel speed," Wendell said, "and you have to trust the heat. Most people fight the overhead pool. You have to let it sit where it wants to sit and guide it, not push it." Lucas nodded, trying to absorb this. Would you be willing to show me sometime?" Wendell looked at him for a moment. "How's your 6G route?" "It's decent." "Come back to me when it's better than decent." It was not unkind. It was simply honest, in the way that the best teachers are honest. Not to discourage, but to establish a real foundation to work from. Lucas Thorne nodded again, and this time the nod was different. This was the nod of a young man who had just received the most useful assessment of his career from someone who had no reason to be gentle about it and chose not to be, which is its own form of respect. In the weeks that followed, the Nova Scotia Community College contacted Wendell about a guest session in the welding program. Don Arsenault put his name forward to the Canadian Welding Bureau's Apprenticeship Advisory Panel. A piece in the Halifax Chronicle Herald ran on the third Saturday of November, and Commodore Bryce, who had a habit of following through, forwarded it to 3 people at Maritime Command, who he thought should read it. Wendell agreed to the college session on one condition: he would bring his own rods. "Obviously," said the program coordinator, who had no idea how significant a condition that was. He went on a Tuesday in November. 12 second-year students. He spent most of the morning at the machine, not demonstrating technique exactly, but letting the students watch him run welds and then asking them what they saw. Not what the weld looked like, what they heard, what the arc was telling them. At the end of the session, the youngest student, a 19-year-old from Pictou County, named Sadie Collier, who had never spoken above a murmur in 3 months of class, asked him how long it took before you stopped thinking about the process and started feeling it. Wendell thought about this seriously the way the question deserved. "Depends on the person," he said, "but you'll know when it happens because you'll stop asking yourself whether you're doing it right. The machine will tell you if you're willing to listen." Sadie Collier wrote this in the margin of her safety sheet. Her instructor saw it and said nothing. Diane Ouellette returned the Lincoln Ideal Arc to the loaner rack after the competition. It was the same machine it had always been. Cracked casing, age-stiffened lead, the ground clamp now properly re-terminated. Before she put it back, she took a strip of white electrical tape and wrote on it with a permanent marker and pressed it flat against the side of the casing above the amperage dial. It read, "Assessed and adjusted by CPO1 Wendell Cormier, October." 2 years later, that strip of tape was still there, because no one at the trade centre had the heart to remove it, and because every new student who asked about it received the same answer. There was a man who came in with an old leather rod roll and walked out with the win, and if you wanted to know how, you sat down, struck an arc, and listened. The leather roll itself was back in Wendell's garage on Windmill Road, hanging on its peg by the door, its stitching intact, its pockets full. On quiet evenings when the harbour light came flat and gold through the small garage window, Wendell would sometimes take it down and run his thumb across the leather, the same way, the same patience, and the conversation between his hands and the work they had always known was a conversation that had not yet found its end.